Hi, everyone. Uh, my name is Nikki. This is the Dharma Gates podcast. I'm a founder and board member for Dharma Gates nonprofit. We're a nonprofit that brings meditation to young people in the form of retreats, in-person retreats, online events, and this offering, which is a podcast. We also have an advising program and some retreats coming up this year in 2023. So if you're interested, go to dharma-gates.org, and I'll share that again at the end. Um, and today I have a special guest, Paul Vincent Cable. Um, so I met Paul while I was in Asia at Sasanaraka Buddhist Sanctuary. We were both postulants to become monks, uh, and we had a lovely time practicing together at that monastery. So Paul is a British-Indian Dharma practitioner, teacher, and coach. After graduating from Cambridge, Paul spent a decade singing Mozart across Europe as an operatic baritone. While going through a deep period of unhappiness, he eventually found the Buddhist teachings through Dr. Ron Browning, who was himself a former Buddhist Zen and Theravada monk. Since then, Paul spent the last 20 years with a lot of different Theravada teachers practicing in monasteries, caves, and kutis in Asia, Europe, and the US. He has extensive knowledge of the suttas as well as of various Theravada meditative traditions. So for the last 10 years, Paul has conducted an experiment with his own lay life to optimize it for Dharma practice. Based on Paul's shared love of the Dharma with Ron, he co-founded the 100 Hours, an education initiative to bring wise and compassionate living and leadership to young people, working particularly in South Africa and India. Paul also created a program for kindergarten focused on loving kindness, which runs in the largest slums in Kenya, as well as refugee camps on the Burmese border. Through his roles as former chairman of the UNESCO UK School Network and co-producer of the Humanitarian Water, Air and Food Awards, Paul brought his understanding of the Dharma into mainstream education and sustainability. He also mentored his son, Ayrton, hope I said that right, a multi-award-winning social change youth leader who introduced a new bill to the UK Parliament at age 9 to end factory farming. So that's all very interesting, Paul. I probably could ask
Thank
you a
you.
million questions about it. Um, the one thing I just before we go further, your child with the factory farming bill. I used to do a lot of various animal rights activism, so that really stuck out to me. And yeah, can you speak about that for a moment? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, totally. So while he was young, so my son's now 20, and when he was small, like really small, like 2, 3, 4 years old, I was really looking at how to introduce him to Dharma, but in a very, very experiential, practical way. And one of the main ways that we did that was through empathy with animals. And it's really amazing it's astonishing really what kids can get. So there was one time that I remember he must have been probably 2, and a fly got trapped in the room. And you know what it's like when there's a fly trapped in the room and they're trying to get out, and flies don't have the distinction of glass, right? So they keep banging into the glass like bam, 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 thinking that they can just fly out, but of course they can't. And so we saw this fly and tried to let him out. Couldn't capture him. We just like trying to capture him to let him out, but we just couldn't. And it was a hot day, and so eventually we just let him fly around and came back a little bit later. And after a while of flying around in this hot room, this poor fly was totally exhausted and dehydrated. So he was lying on the windowsill and just kind of very, very slowly, moving his arms and legs around. And so we got a little bit of water, a tiny bit of water on a saucer, and kind of lifted him onto the edge of the saucer and just let him drink the water. and it's phenomenal. You know, when you look up at a fly really close up, and you see they see the little tongue going like that. And so we spent this really extraordinary time just watching this fly gradually rehydrate himself, and gradually got his strength back. And this time he actually flew out of the window when we opened it for him. And so that was kind of the beginning of my understanding of how to help him really empathize with animals, you know, to really get that they're just like us. You know, they don't want to die. They don't want to feel pain, exactly the same as us. And so later on, he was a little bit older, and we were eating meat. We were eating beef, actually, at that time. And got onto the really a kind of an exploration of, like, where does this come from? And starting to understand, okay, so this actually comes from animals, you know, and what are these animals? Where do they live? And so that the whole kind of exploration into that, and really starting to understand, you know, the entire kind of industrial complex of killing animals. And I as well, actually, was particularly horrified, starting to understand the magnitude of factory farming. And, you know, I couldn't believe it myself when I found out that there are 50 billion animals killed every single year. 50 billion, most of which are chickens. About 40 billion are chickens, and the rest are cattle and pigs and other things. Anyway, so starting to explore this, and he came up with the idea, if people could really understand what was going on here, they wouldn't eat, well, minimally, they wouldn't eat factory farmed food. You know, particularly as he started to understand the conditions that factory farmed animals are kept in. So he came up with the idea of labeling food. You know, so if you buy bacon or you buy eggs or you buy any of these things, and you see from the labeling how the animal was actually kept, then you could make much more conscious choices about what you're really buying. So he came up with this idea for you know, welfare labeling, and introduced it into Parliament. So he was 9 years old at the time. And so it became the beginning of a whole movement to really label food, like, super clearly. So yeah, so that's kind of the background story to it.
Yeah. Wow, that's so beautiful. It makes sense too. I mean, in the UK, you have, when I was really into animal rights, I was following some activists in the UK, and I think that the movement's pretty strong there in terms of animal rights and animal welfare and all that. And it's interesting thinking back on my own practice. I actually got into, you know, I read Eating Animals by Jonathan Foer or something, and that kind of struck me before I was into Buddhism, but it was kind of, you know, it's still the Dharma, just hearing about the animal's conditions and wanting to take action, and, you know, cutting that out of my life when I was in high school as well. So for me, it came kind of before more full-on Buddhism, you could say. And so it was kind of, I had a similar path in a sense. Cool. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
So also very curious about you personally. So like what brought you into the Dharma initially? Like what sort of introduced it to you, and was it gradual, or did you suddenly start diving in? And kind of curious how it progressed for you in that way.
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you. So it was a long journey for me. It started, although I didn't know it at the time, but retrospectively, it started when I was in my teens. And I found a book which you might well know, Zen in the Art of Archery. And it for me, it was a complete mind-opening experience. And, you know, really the whole notion that you could train the heart and mind to be completely unified and to experience just completely transcendental states was a total mind blow for me. And I really wanted to do something with that understanding, but there was no one around me that I could really talk to about it. So I kind of felt incredibly alone with it, really. And in fact, it was almost like I felt shy about discussing it with anybody because it was so out of anybody's experience, you know, around me. So I kept it entirely to myself. And through not finding anybody that I could really discuss it with and really explore it with, it kind of gradually got pushed to the back of my mind. And so I went into my university years and then into my 20s in a very traditional sense, in that I was really following the path that I'd been on from the time I was a little child, which was into the world of music and professional music. And so that was really my entire 20s, which was music, training as an opera singer and then becoming a professional singer. But I started to get myself into more and more pain, really emotional pain, partly because I was earning very, very little money, through all the years of training. It's an expensive business, actually, training as an opera singer. I was earning nothing or very, very little. And I was also terrible at managing money. I was a disaster at financial management. And so I started to get more and more into debt. And you know how it is with debt, it starts slowly, but then it kind of spirals, as it gets bigger and bigger, and you have more and more interest payments. And it was horrible. It was totally horrible. And so by the time I was in my late 20s, I was in a real mess. And increasingly so as I went into my 30s. And so everything was a mess, financially was a mess, and then that impacted my relationships, especially with my wife. And I started to get super depressed, like really anxious and lonely, in the sense that although you can be surrounded by people that you love and who love you, that sense of feeling like a failure, and so feeling kind of disconnected with everybody around me, and unable to really share openly what was going on with me. So yeah, it was a nightmare. And I was looking for answers. I was looking in the personal development world. I read all the Tony Robbins books, and I sat in Waterstones and read practically every personal development book that had ever been written. And it was super interesting, and I learned a lot of stuff, but it wasn't really getting to the root of the matter. I was still very unhappy. And through a series of synchronicities, really, I found the Dhamma when I got introduced to Ron Browning, who you mentioned in the intro. And I'd always wanted to learn the Dhamma or meditation specifically from a Buddhist monk. And when I found out that Ron had been a monk for quite a few years, I was like, I want to learn meditation from this person. So he lived and still lives in California, and I live and lived in the UK. So we formed this telephone relationship for years. I mean, it's still primarily a virtual relationship. But he taught me firstly meditation, the basic instructions, and then increasingly the Dharma around meditation, and it completely transformed my life. It was like, oh my goodness, this is what I've been looking for. These are these incredibly deep answers to pain, to suffering. And I was like, oh my goodness. So yeah, so that was my introduction to it. And so it's been a 20+ year journey since then, just going deeper and deeper and deeper. And as you know, the Dharma is so profound. Even when you've been practicing for quite a few years, you've hardly scratched the surface of it. So yeah, it's been a beautiful journey.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear. So at that time, were you starting to go on retreats or focusing on like a daily life practice? And I'm curious, like what sort of like meditation technique you got up to early on? Like were you doing anapanasati, or did something strike you off the bat? Anything like that?
Yeah, so Ron's primary teacher was Upandita Sayadaw, and Upandita was himself the foremost pupil of Mahasi, who you're familiar with. And so Ron taught me the Mahasi method, essentially. So that was my initial grounding in the practice. And so I created a little kind of self-retreat for myself. So, when I was alone in the house, I would, walk up and down this little kind of pathway I made for myself in our bedroom. And so that was my initial practice, like super simple, just practicing these principles that I'd learned about it. And after a while, so this is now like 3-4 years into it, I felt like I needed to do an immersive retreat. So I actually did a Goenka retreat as my first one. So that was 10 days, as you know, you're probably familiar with the format. So, and that was my first experience of being in a completely immersive meditative experience where, from 4 to 30 in the morning till late at night, that is all you are doing. And it was phenomenal. There was still a lot of pain in me, from what I've been going through, and a lot of physical pain and mental pain, and I felt so much of it starting to kind of come out, seep out of the body and the mind. It was both a very painful but also an extraordinarily freeing 10 days, and that was really kind of like a platform for what happened after that. So when I came back from the Goenka retreat, I continued with part of that practice, still doing the Vipassana body scans, but also going increasingly deeper into the Mahasi practice. And at that time also I was getting introduced to Shui Min and through Utejaniya. And so that whole practice of relaxing the mind was really, really powerful for me, because like a lot of Westerners, I had a lot of tightness in the mind and a lot of striving and over efforting and trying to get this and trying to get that, and so yeah, just watching the mind, relaxing the heart as the core instruction was like, oh my goodness, this is so easy. So that was phenomenal. And so, and a few years later, I then was introduced to the Pawok practice, and I had an incredible opportunity actually. So Pawok, or so his supporters, bought a retreat center in California called Green Valley, which by complete synchronicity happened to be the same retreat center that Ron and his wife had owned for years. So I got introduced personally to Pawok Sayadaw, and on his personal retreat, so he was alone there in the retreat center, he allowed me to come and practice with him. So I was literally the only person in this entire retreat center with Sayadaw. And he was phenomenal. He was so compassionate, and he's such a beautiful person, really. So that was...
Do you remember anything you said? Sorry to interrupt you, but do you remember anything notable maybe Sayadaw said to you, or any impacts it had on you to be with him for that week?
Yeah, I do. At least two major things. So one was Anapanasati was always difficult for me. The breath is not an easy object for my mind, but he was so patient, and he kept saying, "You can do it, you can do it, you can do it," and just that confidence that he had in me, and he probably does this with everybody. That confidence that he has that you can do the practice was so wonderful. Because as you know, with the practice, doubts creep in. It's the nature of it, and so just seeing the doubt as doubt, and having somebody who's very confident in your ability to be able to do it, that was huge. And then another thing I really got from Sayadaw was he used to go through on these daily sort of meditative walks through the forest every single day, religiously. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he would get he had this huge, great big walking stick and walk through these quite steep forests. And he was a strong man, even though he was probably 80 at that time already. And he speaks English, as you probably know. And he would just point to, the flora and fauna around, and he has encyclopedic knowledge of these things. And he would point to this and that animal, this bird and this reptile, and he'd speak about it in such kind of connected terms that you really kind of got, this is a bird, or what we would ordinarily think of as a bird, but this is a being that has the 5 aggregates of a bird right now. So he really connected with this being that was this bird or this lizard, and yeah, it was phenomenal. So I felt so connected with him and with nature, and particularly with other animals, through him and through the way that he talked. So it was amazing. And then from there, having had all of these different experiences through different meditative traditions, I started to just ask the question, okay, so with these different paths, these different ways of practicing, what did the Buddha actually teach? And I was kind of getting a little bit confused by this time. So I was like 10 years into my practice, but having learned all of these different practices, it's like, oh my goodness, so is there a right one? Are they all the right ones? What is this? And also listening to different teachers talk about the Dhamma, trying to understand, and sometimes saying conflicting things. just asking the question, so what did the Buddha actually teach? How can I know what the Buddha taught? And that set off for me what was a journey of several years in really trying to get to the heart of what the Buddha actually taught, and a journey into what's now called early Buddhism. And so I spent a lot of time listening to Anario's talks. That was kind of my entry into it, reading his books on the Satipatthana, and understanding that the Pali Canon has sort of parallel versions, the Agamas, and so this was all the beginning of a whole flowering of understanding for me. And I decided to read everything that we are pretty certain the Buddha taught, which is basically all the four major Nikayas and the core parts of the Khuddaka Nikaya, plus the Vinaya. So that was a super powerful project for me to really kind of dig into, okay, now I can be really confident this is what the Buddha taught. And so that's sort of a summary of my 20 plus years of practice.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we could go into in all of that, especially so many different experiences. And with Ron too, I think Ron was a monk with Gil Fronsdale, right? That's what I had heard
Could be, yeah.
With U Pandita. That's what I had heard. But
Yes.
so part of what we want to talk to today, I mean, I didn't say this at the beginning, maybe I could have, but getting into this theme of the precepts in general, that in the early Buddhist or Theravada framework. That was kind of the idea that struck up this conversation originally. So getting into that a little, what sort of inspired you initially? I know a lot of Westerners, especially, we get into practice because of the first thing has to do with meditation typically, and then often later on, maybe we learn about the precepts, or for some people, both at the same time. Some people just ignore the precepts. Some people, maybe they really just go for the precepts first. That's great too. But I was curious, how that sort of process went for you, and any sort of experiences with. I imagine you started with the 5 precepts and just getting, how that went for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the first instance, Ron taught me the basic meditative instructions, and gradually over a few weeks started to talk to me about what is foundational for a mind that actually has samadhi, a mind that is actually unified, and started to talk to me about this thing that at that time I had no idea about, which was sila. And as you know, it's often translated as virtue or morality, but those are kind of super poor translations, because there isn't an English word that really encapsulates a sila. So that whole notion, one of the translations which is pretty interesting, is integrity. And in the West we tend to think about integrity as being related to honesty, which of course it is. But the notion that integrity can have a much wider and deeper meaning, including non-harming, was revelatory to me. And I realized as I started to learn about the precepts, as Ron was, all about sila and the precepts, as Ron started to teach them to me, was that my sila was terrible. And it was kind of shocking as as I started to learn about it. It's like, oh my goodness. So there's this foundational principle of non-harming, of leading a life that really works, that I have no idea about. And so that was the first thing, just understanding that my sila was terrible, and then gradually starting to understand why sila is so important in the practice, why it is so foundational, why when you think about the Eightfold Path, sila, samadhi, panya, why it's the first thing. And so, as you know, in the way that sila is taught by the Buddha in the discourses, he first of all talks about speech, right speech. What is that? So that whole understanding for me of telling the truth was a long journey, actually. So one of my realizations was how hard it is to tell the truth, and how uncommon it is in the world generally. So for most people, you've probably seen the studies that will tell a conscious lie at least 5 times in a day, let alone in a month or a year. And so that connection, that understanding that our words actually matter, they mean something, they matter for ourselves in terms of our own mental health, our spiritual health, and they matter in terms of our relationships, was an initial part of that understanding. And there's a lot to say about that, so we'll come back to that. So that was kind of the initial thing in terms of understanding, or just starting to explore the precepts, which was really around that precept around right speech. And then looking at right action and starting to look at the other 4 precepts. And again, it was shocking just kind of how poor my sila had been when I reflected back over my life. So, for example, to give you an idea, one of many examples, when I did the Goenka retreat, so I was sitting in the meditation hall, and so there's like 80 people on the retreat, and it's, what meditation halls are like. It's it's dark. There's all these people just sitting in complete darkness, or not complete darkness, but sort of very dim light. So I've got my eyes closed. I'm practicing. I'm doing scanning the body, and this memory came up of when I was 19. So this time I was in my early 30s. So the memory. So this was when I was in Africa when I was 19, and I had been invited and accepted to go on a hunting trip. And at that time, it was just like, it kind of almost felt normal. It's just like, okay, hunting. And I knew a little bit about shooting because I'd been a cadet in the army, an army cadet when I was at school. And so they gave me this, a rifle and a shotgun. And while we were out there, so this is in the bush in Kenya, and at that time you were actually illegally allowed to hunt in Kenya, and we were driving across these plains, and somebody said, "Look at those 2 geese." And probably about 50 yards away from us, there were these 2 really beautiful geese standing very, very close to each other, and without really thinking about it, I pulled out the shotgun and lined it up, pulled the trigger, and killed these 2 geese. So it's when you go on these hunting trips, you have these what's called runners. So they're people who go and run and they get the animals that you've shot. So this boy ran and he got these 2 geese and put them in the boot of the car. So this all happened when I was 19, and I'd forgotten about it. So you can imagine, so I'm sitting in the hall, I'm like 34 years old, and the memory of this came up. And it was, I can't even begin to describe it. It was this sense of horror, like what on earth was I thinking? And just these sort of waves of remorse, coming, and I was crying, so nobody could see me, but I was crying in the middle of this meditation hall. And it just went on. It went on and on and on for about 2-3 hours, just this phenomenal, remorse at what I'd done. And it was all part of, so as you know, the whole practice is really the practice of purification. And I realized later on, when I left the retreat and discussed it with Ron and others, that I'd gone through a really deep purification process. So that was first of all how bad my sila was in the past, and then my awakening, or part of my awakening, to the first precept, to not harm, and just how painful it is, when the heart really gets what harming another being actually means. What killing, what injuring another being really means when the heart actually connects with it. So that was absolutely huge. And then so too with the other precepts, like for example, if we take the second precept, to not take what is not given, I realized as I started to practice that one of the things that I would do as a trainer and coach would be to go into training rooms where other people had left, pencils and rubbers and pens and that kind of stuff, as people do. And I would use it, and then unthinkingly just put it in my pocket and, go home with it. And so I realized in my practice, and this again actually came up in my meditation too, it was like, wait a minute, that's basically stealing, because I'm taking other people's stuff that they have not given me permission to take. And so there was a whole awakening, consciousness around the second precept. What does that really mean? To not take things that are not given to you. And I realized also, again, as the practice developed, that my mind had the habit of taking other people's ideas and kind of presenting them as my own, but without acknowledgement. And so it was like, wait a minute, what am I doing? I'm like, that's like stealing. It is stealing. So that also was a journey, a journey into what these precepts really mean. And so with all of the 5 precepts, it was just a gradual deepening and understanding of firstly how poor it had been, but also just a gradual process of purification, in the heart, understanding how important these are, and how life transforms. I was seeing my own life transform as my own sila was strengthening, and it makes life workable in a way that previously it's not workable. And by that I mean, if you consider that, the ways that the Buddha one of the ways that the Buddha talked about sila, when you have really, really good sila, you feel confident, because you know that other people are, because your behavior gradually becomes blameless, in the sense that you don't lie, you don't steal, you don't kill other beings, you don't hit on other people's partners and all those things. And it creates a confidence in the heart that you can't be justifiably criticized for your behavior. And the Buddha talked about that, that courage and that confidence to stand what he calls in an assembly, but basically with other people, and just knowing that there's a purity there. So that was a really beautiful feeling, just knowing that, ever increasing purity, and of course it impacts your relationships so hugely, because people start to realize that they can trust you. They can trust what you say, and both what you're saying is true about things that you've done in the past, but also there becomes a connection between your words and your future actions. So people start to realize that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. So there's that aspect of integrity. So although that's not actually in the precept, like when you take the 4th precept, you're committing yourself to not speak falsely, which refers to saying things that you know not to be true. But it also has that implication of following through on those things that you say you will do in the future. Mm-hmm. So that's really important, and I really felt the impact of that. That lining up of words and actions, and kind of walking the talk in that sense. So sila's been a long journey for me, and that's just the 5 precepts. And I stopped drinking as well. Actually, I forgot to mention that. And actually, the catalyst for that was a few years later, a few years into my practice, when I was still drinking at that time, and then a friend of mine shared with me that he had joined the 12-step program. And at that time I was fairly clueless about the 12-step program, but he told me what it was and shared with me the story that led to him joining the 12-step program, which was that one day he woke up and he realized he was staring at the sky. And it turned out that he had gotten so drunk, he had fallen into a gutter and just laying there the whole night, kind of comatose. And when he woke up, he opened his eyes, he was looking at the sky, and he was like, oh my God, if I carry on like this, I'm going to die. And that led him to totally give up drinking and join the 12-step program. But there was something so powerful about his story that was like, oh my goodness, I can do that too. I can just give up drinking totally. So I did. So it was a journey, and then later on, I took on the higher precepts as well, 6, 7, and 8, and then of course, like you, when we were at SBS, took on close to monastic level sila. So it's been a long journey.
Yeah, wow, so much. I mean, just reflecting when that story you told of being in the savannah and killing like my whole body, I could just feel the grief within me around. Yeah. That really, it's hard, So I feel for you having,
totally.
Yeah. Imagine that experience on the Goenka retreat. It's probably, I can't imagine really. I mean, it sounds like it would be hard to purify that, but I'm glad you've gone through that process. And
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
for sure. I think that it makes me reflect on some of my own experiences with the precepts, and one thing comes to mind is the how they're not fractal exactly, but it is interesting how as you try, like for me, as I've when I first took on the five precepts, I was like, well, great, I'm following all of them, basically, and I was doing pretty good, but as I like looked at them more closely, it's like it is as you look at them in more detail, like I can refine. If we're just talking about just the five precepts, it's like there's so much I can refine on when it comes to thinking about the fourth precept, which is to not lie. For instance, like not exaggerating, like not even exaggerating by a little bit, like being honest. Like, no, I was
Right.
did whatever. I went for a run that was it was 6 miles. It wasn't eight or whatever it is, or whatever a retreat. I went for a 2 month retreat, so it was a month and a half, not 2 months. So like just these all on this little level, just
Exactly.
being completely honest. And so like for me, that's been kind of inspiring to like try to do a little bit of a study with each of them when I get the chance, and kind of because they go pretty deep and you can get pretty clean with them, but you know there's seems like for me, definitely for me, there's always some room for improvements, and which has been shocking too sometimes, even with the first precept, as someone who I went vegetarian and then vegan and animal rights activism, and realizing like I mean I wasn't intentionally killing, but sometimes like I could be a lot more careful about preventing the death of insects, like especially when I was living in Asia. I was like, wow, this isn't super easy to like live a life that doesn't kill insects. And so it was in Asia, it was a whole new thing. Like, wow, I have to really be, I got to be way more careful, because when I was in Colorado, we don't really have bugs, so it's like it was a lot easier.
Totally. Totally. No, exactly. Exactly. And especially when when we're in really purified or purifying environments, like you said, like at SBS, where you're surrounded by monastics, who've taken on monastic level sila. Yeah, it raises the whole consciousness. Just the mind becomes increasingly aware. And if you think about how the Buddha talks about taking on sila, you become one who is who is aware of the slightest fault. That just so even the tiniest thing. And like you said, with as the practice deepens, the mindfulness gets sharper, the heart purifies, it sees in more and more detail these little things. Exactly all the stuff you were talking about in terms of exaggeration. That was another huge thing for me in terms of purifying my speech. I realized just how much my mind had a tendency to exaggerate stuff. And it was like, wow, this is just shocking. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's wild. Um, and I don't know if there's anything else. We were talking about these five precepts, and I think with this stage we've gone through all of them. I don't know if there's anything else that seems like important to you with the five precepts, or anything that might be helpful to
Yeah,
anyone listening.
thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, one of the things that occurs is, so as you know, with the five precepts, the fourth one covers right speech, or at least an aspect of right speech, which is the aspect of not speaking falsely, musavada. When the Buddha speaks in more depth about right speech, so for example, when he actually explains right speech as a component of the Eightfold Path, he gives the all four aspects of right speech. And so as you know, I'm sure you've got not speaking falsely, but then that second really really crucial one of not speaking divisively.
Mm.
So that sense of in its worst expression, slandering somebody else. So you're saying something about somebody that you know for sure is not true. But even if you know at a slightly lesser level, saying something about somebody that you know is true, but with the intention of undermining that person, So it's creating a separation between people, and so that is also really, really huge, and the karma from it is also very heavy, from undermining other people. We'll come back to that in a second, just around karma of the different precepts. But then the third aspect of right speech, around speaking angrily, or in this not speaking angrily. So I realized for myself that was also a habit, particularly in my mind when somebody was speaking or doing something to me which felt painful, criticizing or kind of blaming me for stuff. Anger would come up, and my mind felt justified in speaking angrily as a way of trying to make them stop, trying to inflict pain back. And so it's like, stop hurting me. And so the mind had justified speaking angrily. And so that was another one which was really important for me in seeing and restraining myself around. The fourth one for me was not such a big issue, which was sampapalapa, which is idle chatter, but it's also so powerful and so important in terms of really purifying speech and really having a life that actually works. So that's one thing I think to mention. So when one's taking on even just the 5 precepts, to really look at that wider aspect of right speech. So there's 4 aspects of right speech. And then I think reflecting on the karmic fruits, both on the dark side from breaking the precepts, but also on the bright side on the happy side of keeping the precepts, is super powerful, super powerful. So for example, if we take the first precept, to not kill, to not destroy life. So the Buddha spoke about all 5 precepts, as you know, in that they are capable, for one who is not yet a stream enterer, of landing us in a very, very dark, painful place upon death. So they're all capable of creating rebirth in some really, really bad places in samsara. But they also have specific karmas relating to them. So, for example, killing or destroying life creates the karma for short life. And injuring other beings creates the karma for sickness, for illness, for disease. So that was very, very helpful for me in just reflecting on these specific karmas. And then, as you can imagine, taking what is not given and stealing creates the karma to have other people steal our stuff. And then the third one around sexual misconduct and misconduct in sensual pleasures. Again, heavy karma. Part one of which is the karma to have, again, other people do that to us. So all of these things come back, kind of like a sort of boomerang effect in this, this ocean of karmas, of actions that we're creating. And then the fourth one also, so when we're not really scrupulous with our speech and we're in the habit of saying things that are not true, we're creating the fruit of that is then to have other people deceive us, and say things to us that are not true, and that can have horrendous consequences. When we act on information that we think is one way, and in fact it's the other way. So, and then from drinking, intoxicating the mind, it creates the karma for heavy delusion, and actually the mind to be stupid in the sense of low IQ, and also from the sense of just not having wisdom, like to really understanding what actually creates happiness and what actually creates suffering. So they all have these specific karmas, and so that's very helpful to reflect on. But on the flip side, keeping really impeccable sila from a 5 precept point of view is so wonderful, because as well as really being foundational in the whole path to liberation and creating extraordinary happiness in this life, they also create specific karmas. So, for example, the first precept creates the karma to have long life. It creates the karma from not injuring, not harming, creates the karma to have really good health. And then the second one around not stealing. So if we're really impeccable about that, then our own stuff doesn't get stolen. Things don't happen to it. And that actually includes things being lost, not just through other people stealing from us, but things being lost through fire, through the water element, through floods, for example. It creates that protection from having our things being lost, in different ways. And then so too with integrity in relationships, it creates the karma to have really beautiful relationships where there's a deep trust between both partners, and not having to worry about what your partner is doing. So it creates that karma to have these very, very fulfilling, rich, deep relationships. So too with speaking the truth, and then of course if you don't drink, it creates the karma for the mind to be bright, for the mind to be wise, to be undiluted. So for me, that was very powerful, just starting to understand these residual results, as well as, of course, the very, very heavy karmas from doing bad stuff. So this was all also part of my journey and my awakening and my, for me, that deepening of those first 5 precepts.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear. I think it's like almost like a push and pull, like sort of in terms of motivation for keeping them. I think some people are more motivated by some sort of type of fear, you could say, of wrongdoing and the consequences, and then there's also the pull of how much better your life is when you follow these precepts. And I think both have affected me at various times. And so that's I'm just thinking like that's the 5 precepts generally. And if people don't know, like as a lay Buddhist, those are generally the ones that are advised that people keep as a minimum, and that the Buddha advised to keep as a minimum, I should say, to help your practice flourish and grow. And that's a whole another conversation around, sila being the basis for samadhi and meditation, which, as a path factor for liberation, I think is, of course, like having good karmic fruits is important, but probably maybe even more important is the way it relates to meditation and the development of the mind in that way. I do want to get on and start talking a little bit more about more precepts, but maybe if you could say something briefly, or if you have any thoughts around silas, and the 5 precepts and their role with meditation, and like sort of what do you think about that, or what suttas come to mind, things like that.
Totally. Yeah. The way the Buddha talked about this is that it's so foundational. The 5 precepts are so foundational in the practice that if we don't keep the precepts, just leaving aside the karma that we're creating, our practice will go nowhere. And the reason is that the heart and mind are so disturbed. There's a background agitation, that goes on when our sila is not pure. So if we want to have success in the practice, let alone just general happiness in life and workability in life, those 5 precepts are really, really essential. And the way the Buddha spoke about it is very beautiful and powerful, which is he talked about the happiness of non-remorse. So if you're really, really keeping the precepts, you're very, very scrupulous about your sila, when you look at your own behavior, happiness arises, because it's like, I'm pure. My behavior is pure. My heart is pure because of how I act. And that happiness of non-remorse has another consequence, happy consequence, which is the happiness of piti, bliss. So literally, bliss, that mental factor of bliss, of piti, arises when we reflect on the purity of our own sila. And then from that piti, then arises an even more refined happiness, which is sukha. And from the sukha arises passaddhi. So passaddhi, that tranquility of the body, and also tranquility of the mind. And arising dependent upon that passaddhi, that tranquility, is samadhi, unification of mind. And so the jhanas, if you want to enter the jhanas, and then as dependent upon that samadhi, then you can use the samadhi for insight, to really see the nature of how things are, and then the insight, then in turn leads to liberation. So the entire path, it's really phenomenal. The entire path unfolds from having great sila. And the Buddha spoke about it as a natural consequence. So if you have great sila, as a natural consequence, you feel non-remorse. As you feel the happiness of non-remorse, as a natural consequence, piti arises. As a natural consequence, sukha then arises. As a natural consequence, tranquility, passaddhi. As a natural consequence, samadhi. And as a natural consequence of that, insight and liberation. So the entire path unfolds. It's kind of like a domino effect from having really, really great sila. So it's like amazing. It's like, wow, that is so powerful, so phenomenal. So yeah, so just by keeping the 5 precepts alone, the entire path can, and will unfold. So yeah, so really the 5 precepts are non-optional in this in any wise, with any wise way of looking at life, any way of looking at the practice. They are completely non-optional. So then the question becomes, what about taking higher sila beyond that? And as you and I have talked about in the past, is it worth, what are the benefits of then taking on higher sila? And there are, of course, benefits, of the 6th, 7th, and 8th precept. So yeah, so it's just so powerful, honestly.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I really, it resonates so strongly with all the things you're saying. We can get into this more when we talk maybe about the 8 precepts a bit, but just for me personally, we had this conversation and you were framing the precepts as this, especially maybe the 6th, 7th, and 8th, which we'll talk about, but this feeling of relief, which is maybe similar to what the Buddha is talking about with around non-remorse, which sounds like they're a similar type of word. And just for me, I mean, we had a conversation which inspired me to go from, I was taking 7 precepts to 8 precepts, but lately I've just been waking up with a lot of joy and happiness, like more than I've ever had, even without meditating. It's just like my heart feels just like lighter, and I do just feel like a lot more joy. It's like, it's kind of crazy, like, because even without meditation, it's just this natural kind of effect of what probably from just taking on more precepts. And I wouldn't have predicted it. I didn't, it's like, oh, not eating after noon, that's gonna make me like ecstatic in the morning, like, but it does. And it's kind of crazy.
Right.
And same thing with refraining from sexuality and music and all these things that I generally liked, but now so maybe at that point we can transition into. So I wanted to say, like, maybe for some people who aren't or new to like early Buddhism or Theravada, we can just talk about these different, like, there's some people take the 5 precepts, which what we discussed, what you just said, you should do it, or whatever. It's like, it's good baseline recommendation from the Buddha for any happy life. And so then the other options, though, generally there seems like there's 5, and then for lay people in monasteries are always keeping 8, and then there's also 10 precepts which a lay person could theoretically take. So those are the most common ones, and we'll talk about what those each are. And then there's also varieties. Various teachers sometimes recommend like 7 precepts, which I was on for a long time, and even 8 without brahmacharya. I know folks who do. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about those variations, but first let's just go into like, what is the 8 precepts, generally, like, what does that look like stepping up from 5 in the most classical sense? And yeah.
Yeah, great question. One of the important things around this whole conversation, and in fact around Sila in general, is to really hold it in the wider context of the whole path to liberation. And the path to liberation is the path of letting go, the path of renunciation. So even with the core 5 precepts, all of those are actually an act of letting go. They're an act of renunciation. So, with the first precept, just letting go of just that very gross behavior of killing. So it's a restraint of the heart, of the mind, and it's letting go of those sorts of behaviors. So then the question becomes: so having let go of the kind of behaviors that creates breaking those 5 precepts, what else can we then let go of? What else is then particularly conducive to liberation? So the 6th precept, dealing with food, is huge, just huge, in terms of something that really, really supports the practice. So many times throughout the discourses, the Buddha presences the whole issue of moderation in eating. It's just such a big thing. And, the Buddha knew, because he was a Samma Sambuddha, he knew how things are. He knew the effect on the body of eating to excess. And he knew the effect on the body, and he knew the effect on the mind as well, completely. And so he knew that when we are moderate in our eating, that is extremely supportive of the body then being calm, and by extension the mind being calm, and then by extension insight and liberation. So food plays a really fundamental role in the whole path to liberation. So if we overeat, we're making life hard for ourselves. I mean, we're making our practice hard, but we're even making life generally hard for ourselves. So there's the wonderful story of King Pasenadi. So King Pasenadi, as you know, was really a major figure in the Buddha's life, in the entire teaching, the sasana. And he, as a young man or a younger man, was a real glutton. He used to crazily overeat, because he had access, you can imagine, right? He's a very big, powerful king. He had access to any food that he wanted. And he did. He really did. So when he sat down to eat, Pasenadi would order a bucket, literally a bucket, that's the translation of the Pali word, of rice, so this huge great thing like this, and then a similar sized bucket of curry and sauces. And he would sit and eat through the whole lot. So you can imagine, first of all, over a period of time, he got seriously fat. And when he ate, you can imagine eating all of this hot curry, massively stuffing himself. He would sweat horrendously. And you can also imagine, when you overeat, you sleep a lot. So he would just he would eat and then just fall asleep, and kind of loll around, and just unable to do anything. So his whole life was seriously going downhill. And he used to feel terrible as well, because you know what it's like when you overeat, your whole body starts to ache and feels painful, and your life's just a mess. So this is what happened to him. And one day, it was so bad. So he went to the Buddha, and he was like, Venerable Sir, this is, and the Buddha saw him coming, and saw him sweating, and saw his mind distracted because he was in such a mess. And so he counseled him by, first of all, explaining to him what happens when you overeat. So first of all, you cut your life short. So the Buddha's saying you are taking years off your life by overeating. Secondly, you are making yourself ill. You will get diseases, you will get sicknesses through overeating. Thirdly, you're sleeping a lot, so you can't conduct the affairs of state. You can't run your life. And it's also creating aches in your body, so you're unhappy. So the Buddha started explaining what happens when you overeat. And Pasenadi's listening to this, and he's like, "Oh my goodness, wow!" And so what happened at the end of the instruction was Pasenadi instructed one of a young Brahmin who had been listening to all of this, to read back, or to recite back to him the entire sutta every time he sat down to eat. So he would sit down to eat. Before he touched the food, he would listen back to all the advice the Buddha had just given him. And he realized, as he started to do that he started eating less and less and less and less. So over a period of time, this great big bucket gradually shrank down to like a mug, like a mug's worth of rice and a mug's worth of curry. And over a few months, over a few years, he lost all of this enormous amount of weight that he'd been carrying around. He became slim. He became full of health and vibrancy, and he was so happy, totally transformed his life. And so food has a massive effect just in those very, very basic ways. And then it also has a huge effect on the stability of the mind. So when the Buddha's talking about restraint in eating, he's both talking about restraint in terms of the actual portion sizes that we eat, but he's also talking about restraint in terms of not eating after midday. So not eating in the afternoon, not eating in the evening. So that sixth precept, where you take on that resolution to not eat at all from solar noon until the dawn of next day, that becomes your fasting period. And so the Buddha talked about that, about how important that is, how powerful that is in creating happiness in the body, and by extension happiness in the mind, and creating, we were talking earlier about that non-remorse. It also has the happiness of non-remorse. It's like you feel pure through not overeating and through having that fasting period. And you've read yourself so much of the modern science that's now come out around the science of fasting, even intermittent fasting. So you're fasting 16, 17, 18 hours a day, phenomenal benefits from that. And so, going back to what the Buddha was saying about health, so we now know that if you fast more than 16 hours a day approximately, your body goes into autophagy, which means that the cells regenerate, which is like totally phenomenal, and so there are these beautiful, amazing stories of people curing themselves from serious diseases, including even cancer, simply through moderation in eating. So that's how powerful it is at a physical level. And then at a mental level, it also tremendously, it supercharges the practice. You and I both experienced that at SBS, where you're in that monastic environment. There's no food available after midday. So it's not like you can kind of walk to the fridge and, take stuff out, or walk down into town and, get yourself an ice cream. There is no food available. And that monastic practice, which you're familiar with, of not being able to store food overnight, that's what that's about. It's about not having food easily available, and so the mind just has to let go of food and of the desire for food in the afternoon and in the evening, and it's so powerful. So that's just the sixth precept, and then of course there's a seventh precept around restraint, around entertainment, and beautifying the body, and then the eighth one around not sleeping on luxurious beds. All of them so supportive of the practice, so supportive of the mind, and the seventh precept particularly around guarding the sense doors, which is a whole topic that we can talk about. So and so all of it is basically sloping the heart and the mind in the direction of liberation. It's all renunciation. So with the sixth precept, we're renouncing being able to eat whenever we feel like it, or more accurately, whenever craving feels like it and delusion feels like it, because these are impersonal forces of mind, right? It's anatta. So the craving that comes up, it's not me. It's not I am hungry. It's just there's just craving, this empty force of craving that arises in the mind. So it's really powerful, and and the higher the sila we take on, the more the mind, the more the heart is sloping towards freedom, towards liberation. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, one thing we were discussing, even with it's crazy how the science is now showing that not only intermittent fasting is healthy, but the healthiest period is that dawn to midday period. That's what the science is showing us now. So even like doctors who know nothing about Buddhism are recommending, if you're going to do the fasting, try to do it in the morning. That's best for cholesterol levels and all sorts of things. So that's definitely remarkable. I think for me, I just took on the sixth precept as well as, that's the main one I just added a week ago. For me, for a while, I had a lot of resistance, basically very attached to food. It's probably the main reason. But so taking it on was challenging, but the benefits have been, so varied and so many. But I find, even when I overeat, if I'm constrained in time, then enough time goes by and I feel good again, because I'm not going to keep eating like dinner or something. So even if I overeat a little bit, which I have a little as I've adjusted, there's still sometimes I feel there's some fear around, I'm not going to have enough food later or something like that. So, but even if I do that, then by the evening I'm still light, because you're not taking in more and more food, and so I'm still sleeping great. And And yeah, so, and for me as well, I think is why it was one of the, like, the last things to take on was, it was kind of, I started to reflect, and I think it was like, I really was enjoying having that comfort of food, whenever I wanted, basically. So yeah, I don't know if you have any advice for people who are like taking on this precept or interested in it. I mean, one thing I definitely, experientially for me, I think that's, it does seem like sometimes I have this fear around midday, so I eat a little bit more than I probably should, and um, that's one thing I think I'm trying to refine, because it still just causes suffering, because I'll be overfed and then I don't feel great after, even if I still feel the benefits, even doing that. So, and yeah, I don't know if you have any other, people, probably just advice for people who might get hungry at dinner time, for at least for the first week or two, probably.
Totally, totally. Yeah, a few thoughts around that. So one is something that transformed my view about the notion of enough, and can you eat enough, like in one, let's say in the morning, or even in one sitting, was I read an account, heard an account of quite a well-known bodybuilder. So this is a big guy. This guy is like 240 pounds, and he's lean as well. He's like 240 pounds and 5% body fat or something like that. Really crazy. And this guy eats one meal a day. So all of the calories that he needs to nourish that huge body, he manages in one sitting, and not like stuffing himself, but just by measured eating. And he found that his overall energy levels, and actually even his growth and development as a sportsman, just kind of went up through the roof through taking on that practice of restraint, and in his case, literally eating one meal a day. So this is like a one and a half hour kind of window for eating.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how many calories he was taking in, probably a lot, 3,000-4,000 calories plus probably to for that kind of body, because you know how much bodybuilders eat, right? But he was managing to do that in a relatively restrained way, and so that shifted a lot for me. That's possible even for an elite sportsman. And then coming back to this thing about cravings, so what do you do when, like you said, you're in the middle of the afternoon or the evening, and it's like, oh my God, I just want to eat. A wonderful refuge with this is the four foundations of mindfulness, and in particular, the third foundation, which is mindfulness of mind. So when the craving comes up, so just inclining the mindfulness to see, this is craving. So that's the first thing. So because what tends to happen with the mind is the default tendency of the mind is to be identified with whatever arises. So it's kind of like, I'm hungry, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm deciding this, I'm doing that. So there's an identification with it and a sense of I always behind it. But when the mindfulness gets strong, it sees that that's actually not the case. That actually really what's happening is that these impermanent, impersonal forces of mind and heart arise and then pass away. And that's with everything, any sense of happiness or sadness, any cravings, any decisions that we make, that they're just these impersonal forces of mind that arise. So with craving, just inclining the mindfulness to see, whoa, okay, this is craving. This is what craving, these are the kind of thoughts that the mind thinks when craving arises. And you know what it's like when craving starts to get a hold of the mind. It starts to put the body into action. We start walking towards the kitchen and find ourselves opening the fridge and reaching in for the ice cream or whatever it is. So, and all of that happens because the craving isn't clearly seen in the mind. So there's identification, and through the identification, it then becomes a force that runs the mind, kind of like a computer program. Basically, it's like you press play or go, and the program runs, the craving program runs. But when there's clear seeing through the mindfulness, craving, this is craving, then the identification, there's disidentification with it. It sees it just as it is, And then it no longer becomes this force which is unconsciously driving everything, driving the thoughts, driving the behaviors. So that is so huge. And in particular with craving, it's really, really important also to incline the mind to see the second foundation of mindfulness, which is feeling. So with craving, the dominant feeling is pleasant. So it's like, oh, this is just feeling. It's just feeling. So feeling, like everything else, is impermanent. It arises and it passes away. So that this pleasant feeling is not me, it's not mine, it's not myself, it's just feeling. So when the mindfulness can actually see these forces as for what they are, it can see craving as just craving, feeling as just feeling. It no longer becomes this mechanism that's just unconsciously driving our behavior. So that's super powerful, in terms of dealing with cravings and dealing with everything. I mean, really, the whole path to freedom is really predicated on seeing any force of mind, whether it's craving or anything else, for what it is. This is what it is. It's impermanent. It's not self. It's not myself. It's just a force of mind. It's just feeling. Or if it's a sensation in the body, it's just a sensation in the body. It's not me. It's not mine. So yeah. So that's probably the main thing actually in terms of dealing with cravings. I mean, there are some tactical things that, like we've talked about in the past, around allowables, this and that food that's allowable, and that's a little topic in itself. But really the fundamental thing is just seeing craving as craving, and then it's pretty easy.
Yeah, yeah. I've been trying to do that a bit more lately, and especially focusing on the physical sensations in the body, like where craving kind of crops up in the chest, and I feel it in heart and kind of stomach and all these different areas, and I found that to be really, really helpful to kind of
Interesting.
give
Wonderful.
myself some distance from it, whatever I'm craving. But food is definitely one of those things at times. Cool. And so that's the sixth precept. Maybe we can talk about the seventh and eighth and what those also entail. And yeah.
Totally. So the seventh, yeah, definitely. So the seventh has two parts to it. So as you probably know, if you take on 10 precepts, the seventh and the eighth. The seventh is around entertainment, restraining from entertainment, and then the eighth is around adorning the body.
Okay.
But when you take on the 8 precepts, those two are combined into a single precept, which is the seventh precept. So with both of those things, and particularly around entertainment, so you know as well as I, and as well as anybody, what access to entertainment does to the mind, and how easy it is. We just pick up our iPad and we have access to a universe of entertainment. And it's not just like the obvious things like Netflix, even like reading the news. There may be a certain amount of news we need to read for our work, but normally it's not very much. But when the mind starts kind of getting really interested in the latest Donald Trump story or something, it's no longer really serving a practical purpose. It's oops, just lost my earpiece. It's it's just entertainment. It's just the mind kind of gorging itself on this stuff, right? So restraining from that is so powerful, so important as well. It has this very deluding effect on the mind. When it has easy access to entertainment, the mind just kind of checks out. And that's kind of the effect of the delusion of the moha. It's sort of like it has a checking out effect. So the mindfulness goes out of the window, and the mind just gets lost, just totally lost in all the stories of whatever the Prison Break or whatever it is we're watching on Netflix, or the stuff in the news, or anything else. So it becomes an escape, and not a good escape. So there are escapes which are great, which are wholesome, and in fact the entire practice, the entire path to nibbana, in some respects, it's a translation of the word nisarana, which means escape, but it doesn't mean an escape from reality in the way that it's sometimes depicted. It's like, oh, you're just kind of escaping from is trying to escape from life. It's actually the opposite of that. It's actually looking at life and seeing what life actually is that provides that pathway to a higher happiness. So the seventh precept is really important, and one of the core principles of the entire practice is being able to guard the sense doors. And so that means, in terms of the way the Buddha spoke about it, he spoke about not allowing the mind to grasp what he calls the signs and features of something that's being seen or heard or smelt or anything else. So grasp it through craving, grasp it through aversion. And that happens when the mind doors are unguarded, or the sense doors are unguarded. So when there's no mindfulness, and also when we, from an external point of view, kind of subject ourselves to entertainment, it becomes very, very difficult to guard the mind door. To really mindfully watch Netflix is tough. Not totally impossible, but it's very tough. So, the seventh precept is really powerful as a support. And as you know, there are so many ways of, blocking off stuff on our iPads and computers and all of these apps that shut things down at various times, which are really, really helpful. I've got this one on WhatsApp now. I think it might actually be the default one that's used, where it just shuts the app off after 5 minutes. It's so great. And so that's the seventh precept. And then the eighth precept.
Before we move on there, I just wanted to
Sure.
add in with the blocker stuff. Yeah, that's been huge for me.
Yes.
Like screen time on the iPhone works really well to set time limits and also just block things. Like I basically, fully blocked YouTube and Instagram, anything that was where my mind was just would see something and then just go deeper and deeper and just, waste a lot of time. So that has been absolutely life-changing for me this summer, engaging with these. Because for me, the addiction around those, especially the sort of technology and internet entertainment, was so strong that, I felt relatively hopeless in terms of like, as long as I had unlimited access, I didn't know how to restrain myself. And so those screen time on the phones, also Freedom is cool. Freedom has an iOS and Android. And then on my laptop, Cold Turkey will just block like anything you want, and also can just turn your laptop off for periods of time. And it has scheduled blockers too. So I block certain, between certain hours, I basically can't do much after like 8 or 9 p.m. on there. And then, so then there's some stuff like totally blocked forever as well. So that stuff has been super helpful for me. And I think in the nowadays, this precept is with social media. I mean, I feel like we have these huge industries that are just designed to entertain and to swallow up all of your attention and mind energy, and so that one's probably become increasingly difficult. With all of them are getting, seems like society is making sense pleasures and everything more and more enticing, but that one especially seems challenging nowadays with laptops and tablets and all that.
100%. No, that's great. Yeah, and like you said, there are so many blockers now, and for me, those blockers that basically turn your iPad or whatever it is into a brick are the best. Because how on some of the blockers it gives you the option to override it, like for 5 minutes or 15 minutes or something like that, and that's just like an invitation to Mara. It's just like, okay, just another 5 minutes. But when it just dies and you can't do much about it, perfect.
Yeah, it's nice. It's so liberating. It's been unbelievable for me to engage with those. I'm like, I can't believe I discovered them. I think I'm so happy how much time I'm saving, but I do think back. I'm like, wow, hundreds of thousands of hours could have been saved, and are being saved now. Thankfully, it's a lot of time. If you think about people, I think it's like 6 to 10 hours a day. I think on screens is like average. So we're talking it's an enormous amount of time. But yeah, anyways, that one's definitely
exactly
near the heart for me.
Very much so. And a related thing on this whole topic is, if we ask the question, well, so why does the mind want to watch Netflix? Why does it want to spend the time, watching, essentially gossip about what's going on in the news. Um, the two major forces of mind tend to be delusion and craving, and really that opens up that whole question of where happiness is, because those are the mind's default places to go when it's trying to be happy and when it's trying to not suffer. It's what we've done since beginning this time in samsara. And what the Buddha's teaching with the Dhamma is higher happinesses. Happinesses that are higher both in their goodness and in their purity, in their quality, and which when it actually leads to ever higher happinesses and ultimately to the happiness of liberation, of nibbana. And so this whole topic that we're talking about, which is sila, is very much a higher happiness than sense pleasures. In the way that the Buddha gives gradual discourses, he'll often speak about, if you ask yourself, well, what's a higher happiness than sense pleasures? And he speaks about the happiness of giving. So sense pleasures are basically about getting. The mind's trying to acquire. So that's acquire material things, for example. Just trying to. It's kind of like gorging itself on getting stuff. So what's the opposite of that? Giving. Letting go. So the kind of the next higher happiness from sense pleasures is giving. The happiness of dana, of chaga. And then what is the next higher happiness from that? Sila, which as we've been talking about, is a beautiful happiness just in and of itself. It has the happiness of purity. It has the happiness of blamelessness, and it's just really extraordinary. It's only when you really start to experience really good sila that the heart really knows, wow, oh my goodness, I feel so happy from the purity. And then, okay, so what's even better than that? That's when you start getting into the happinesses of absorption. And as we talked about earlier, those are a natural consequence of really, really good sila. It just naturally leads to the jhanas and to absorption. And then what's an even higher happiness than that? Insight, the happiness of the heart and mind, really seeing that everything's impermanent. It's just arising and passing away. That there's nothing of any substance in any of this, in any of the seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, cognizing, anything. And this whole experience that we have and ever have had and ever will do, it's just impermanent. And then what's even higher than that is the happiness of nibbana, of cessation. So there's this very kind of clear pathway and hierarchy, if you like, of happinesses. And so all these things that we're talking about, they're all gateways. Their happiness is in and of themselves, all of these aspects of sila, and they're gateways into this ever more extraordinary and beautiful happinesses. So it's just so great.
Yeah, I hadn't heard it delineated, and I've heard it in like more coarse chunks of, I think, like happiness of, well, like sense pleasures, and then happiness of samadhi, and then happiness of liberation. But it's really interesting to hear the whole spectrum of sense pleasures, dana, sila, samadhi, vipassana or panya, and then
Insight. Yeah, exactly.
and
Exactly.
that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. It really clarifies them. And, I mean, it's beautiful, and I think like one thing comes to mind is just having to let go of sometimes the lower happiness to get to the higher happinesses, at least in terms of letting go of sense pleasures. I guess you don't really have to let go of dana and sila to go higher than there. But at least, when going from
Yeah, well, I mean those. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I mean, certainly they're not to be clung to. So even these higher happinesses can be clung to. Even the jhanas can be clung to, and they can then become obstacles to complete liberation. Mm-hmm. So for sure, there's that notion and that importance of continually letting go, even of those higher happinesses. There's a discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya where the Buddha talks about not stopping short, the Maha Asapura Sutta. So not stopping short basically means is what you're talking about. So for example, not stopping short with just being generous. It's like, okay, great. So I've now got this higher level of happiness, and the Buddha talks about how one of the ways that the mind can stop short with it is when your ego starts to get in there, and you start to kind of think, oh yeah, I'm such a generous person, and it starts to disparage other people who are not as generous. So it becomes a whole kind of mana, kind of ego thing. And so too with any of these things, the mind can start to have ego about its sila. Like, my sila is so good and your sila is really not so good. And with the jhanas, I've got fourth jhana and you've only got second or something, which sounds funny, but it actually does happen.
I mean, I see my mind doing that already with sila, sometimes. And so one thing I wanted to add in too was like, so there's this 5, and then making the jump to 8 often includes the third changing as well. And so maybe we can get into that a little bit. Whereas the third precept goes from not, as I understand it, not like not committing adultery, so not, trying to break up relationships or have relations with someone, whatever, adultery, and then or not sexually assaulting, not raping. But then that changes to no sexual contact when you go to 8, typically. And I don't know if you can speak about that a little bit. And what's the, I think in some ways there's some parallels with the food one, probably. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the third precept typically, kamesu michachara, is not misconducting oneself in sensual pleasure, is the literal way of translating that. As you said, when the Buddha expands on that, he's talking about, and he actually goes through a whole list of not transgressing, with other people's wives or partners, with people who are under the protection of their parents, with people who are engaged, so he goes through a whole list of those sorts of things. And the common theme or thread underneath all of those is where there isn't consent. So, for example, if you're in a relationship and then you start having a relationship with somebody else outside of it, almost certainly your partner doesn't know about it. They haven't given their permission. So that lack of permission, that lack of consent is common throughout all of those. Or if you start having a relationship with somebody else's partner, pretty likely their partner doesn't know about it, right? So it's as distinct from going to a swingers party, where everybody's married to other people and everybody knows it, so there's permission. Yeah. So that's that precept. Then when we get onto when we upgrade it to the brahmacharya, to celibacy, it takes on a whole new depth, really. And so of course, when you become a monastic, you automatically take on that particular level of sila, and that plays such a big role in your monastic discipline. And for a bhikkhu, for a monk, one of the 4 things that ends your monkhood is sex. So and the same for a nun as well. So it's a really big and an important step when you do that. So then it's an interesting question about taking that on in lay life. So it makes a difference, obviously, if you're in a relationship or you're not in a relationship. So if you're not in a relationship, it then becomes a decision that you are making for yourself. It doesn't really impact anybody else. If you are in a relationship, then that then becomes a discussion with your partner. And in the cases that I know of where it works, there needs to be a very strong sense of alignment. So ideally, it's an alignment of people where both people in the relationship are actually in the Dhamma. So there's that shared context of liberation. There's that shared context of why are we actually in a relationship. And what it really comes down to is supporting each other in the path. So really being there for each other in the path and supporting each other in purity. That's a pretty rare kind of relationship, but they exist for sure. And I know several. So it is possible. It is absolutely possible to be celibate when you're in a relationship, in a partnership. the younger you are, of course, the tougher it is. You know, if you're a guy, the more testosterone you've got flowing through your body. But still, it's possible. So those are kind of the broad brushstrokes of it. And then, if you do decide to take on the brahmacharya, if you do decide to take on celibacy, then there's an interesting, important question around what most supports the heart, what most supports the mind in actually maintaining that celibacy. And there's an external sort of aspect to it, and there's an internal aspect. So the external aspect is not allowing the sense doors to come into contact with things that arouse desire, essentially. So in the most obvious case, if we start looking at porn, what is that going to do to the mind, right? So that's kind of like a really obvious case. But also, if we spend a lot of time on the beach with people who are wearing hardly any clothes, that also is likely to do things to the mind. So that then raises the question: how, from an internal perspective, how can we train the heart? How can we train the mind to regard the body in a way that is actually conducive to liberation? And there are various ways that the Buddha taught with this. One, at a sort of entry level, if you like, is really seeing that the body is just what he called four elements. So it's just, earth elements. So anything that is solid is earth elements. So, for example, bones, skin, flesh they're just solid things. It's just earth element. In the same way as the table is earth element. The sofa is earth element. And so seeing that the earth element, whether it's internally, it's in the body, or it's externally, doesn't belong to me. So how can that be so? How can it not belong to me? Okay, so take your hand. So supposing you had a horrible accident and you lost your hand. Okay, so what then happened? Did I lose a bit of myself? Does that make any sense? And you can actually do the same process with every part of the body. I mean, even the brain, incredibly, as you probably know, you can now transplant most or even all of the brain now. So even these supposedly, seemingly core aspects of, quote, ourselves can all be transplanted and can all be destroyed or damaged. So what does that mean? Does that mean like eye? We talk about the eyes as being like the gateway to the soul or the self. There's so much about that in literature. So what does that mean about if you lose your eyeball? I read this case of a prisoner in an American prison a few years ago who had a psychotic episode, and he pulled one of his eyeballs out, literally, just like kind of did that. And then on a later occasion, he did the same with his other eye. So these eyeballs, gone, nothing, completely gone. So what does that mean? Did he pull a part of his self out? What happened to that self that's now in the eyeball? So once you start looking at the body, deconstructing it in this kind of way, you can start to see that this body cannot be myself. It just doesn't make sense. And it starts to reduce sexual desire very, very strongly. So both in oneself, and then when you start looking at your partner or anybody else, you see it's the same thing. It's just these four elements. So that's one way of doing it. If you want to get more hardcore, and this is traditionally only monastic practice, it's worth presencing that. But there are lay people who do it, including myself, is to practice what the Buddha taught as the 32 parts. And really that's starting to look at the body as it actually is. So these 32 parts, you've got head hair, you've got body hair, nails, teeth, skin, so those are the first five. And then you just keep going through the body. It just gradually deconstructs the body into these 32 parts. And with each part, you start to see, well, it's just head hair, for example. This hair that might seem attractive on my head right now, but then if it comes out in the shower and you see it in the bath or at the bottom of the shower, is it so attractive after that? Even more so from somebody else, right? You see somebody else's head hair. Is that so attractive after all? And gradually you train the mind to really see these body parts for what they actually are. So, this is a huge topic. I mean, we can do multiple podcasts on this whole relationship with the body, whether it's the four elements, whether it's 32 parts or any of that. But there are ways of training the mind to actually see the body as it really is. And when you do that, that sensual desire, that lust just kind of goes down, 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 down. Another classic way is in the Mahadukkha Kanda Sutta, where the Buddha goes into detail about, right now your partner is young and beautiful, but what happens when they get old, when they're 80, 90, 100 years old? They're bent over like a hinge bracket, and they've got wrinkled skin, and their hair's all fallen out, and completely decrepit. Is that person now as attractive as they were then, as they are now? So to when they're sick, and then they're lying down, and there's urine and excrement everywhere, or even when they're dead, and what happens to the body when it starts to decompose, it's horrendous, right? So the Buddha goes through a whole kind of guided process of just seeing that is what's going to happen to this person who right now your mind is so attached to. Super powerful, and again, like I was saying earlier, it's pretty hardcore stuff. But for those who really want to go deep into the practice, and particularly into this aspect, it's really, really powerful.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. I think looking for a way to create my own 32 parts practice to start that. Something that hasn't picked up a ton of traction because it's it's kind of gruesome to me, like at times. But I could probably find a way of. I guess if you had an advice for like, what would be an easy way, like a simple way to start like a practice like that? Like 5 minutes, 10 minutes a day or something. Like what, because for me, like going through, to me, it's like too many parts. Like I don't want to go through 32. I guess I just learn it and do it. But I know they do like 5 parts at the ordination ceremonies, and I don't know if you have any sort of simplified or easier, ways into that sort of practice. Do you have any ideas?
Yes, I do. A really good resource for this is Bhikkhu Analayo. He does a shortened form of the 32 parts, which, if I remember right, has only 4 or 5 parts. So I'm pretty sure there's head hair, I think teeth, skin, and bones. Those are the 4 that I remember that he uses. So just those 4. And the reason why he chooses those 4 is the mind already knows them very well. You see your hair every day, right? So too your teeth, so too your skin. And then bones, our minds know bones pretty well because we see so many images of bones. We see so many skeletons. We know what a skull looks like. So it's quite easy to visualize. So I think that would be a great way to start. Just take those 4, and with each one, you can literally do this in 4 or 5 minutes. You just spend a little bit of time. Start with head hair, and what you're doing is you're visualizing what does a head hair look like. So all the way, like if you can imagine a hair that's actually come out of the head. So there's a root, you can see the root of it, and then there's the hair itself. So that might be a short hair, it might be a long hair, depending on how long you've grown your hair. And then you can start to see the thickness of it, the texture of it, the color of it. And it's just like, this is head hair. That's all that it is. It's not me, it's not mine. Even better if your hair's actually fallen out of the head and you can actually look at it on the palm of your hand, right? Then it's so obvious, this cannot be me, this cannot be mine, it's just fallen out of my head. And it cannot be that attractive either, because if I don't wash my hair for a few days, it doesn't look so good, it doesn't even smell so good. So that's a pretty good one, easy one to start with. And then so too with teeth. There are lots of images on the internet of teeth that have come out of the mouth, where a dentist has actually extracted it. And it's pretty amazing because when you look at your teeth in the mirror, you're only seeing the bottom part of the tooth, because most of the tooth is the root. And so you see the whole thing with the root, and it's like, oh my God, that's awful. And the mind actually starts to get what this actually is. And also you can start to reflect what happens to teeth as they decay, when they fall out. How can this be me? How can this be mine? So with all of them, you're inclining the mind to see the anatta, to see the non-self nature of it. And then so too with skin. Right now, you're young and handsome, so you've got great skin, but when in 50 years, when you're not so young, it may not look so wonderful, right? So, but just seeing skin as skin, That's all that it is. It's this stuff, as the Buddha talked about it. It's like a bag that holds the rest of the body, and it's got these holes in it. It's got holes for the eyes, holes for the nose and the mouth and the ears. So you can just imagine this bag with a few holes in it, which is basically what skin actually is, and it's the biggest organ in the body. So it's like a really big bag, and so too with bones. You can just look at an image on the internet of a skeleton. Or just take a single bone, particularly the skull. Skull's so great, and it's like, oh, bone. That's what this is. When I tap my forehead, that's what this is. It's bone banging against bone. That's the reality of it. So that's how I was just practicing it, and just a few minutes every day, you would be amazed just how quickly the mind starts to penetrate it and starts to see, my goodness, that's actually what this really is.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. That I feel like for the first time for me that I'm able to grasp that practice a little bit more. I don't know why. Well, I kind of know why, but I've had a lot of aversion to that practice for a long time. So for very obvious and non-obvious reasons, but I feel like that gives me a taste of how I can maybe start to engage with it, and maybe anyone listening as well, hopefully. And yeah, cool. And so one of the things, I noticed,
Wonderful.
which is interesting. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just a very small final thing on that. We often tend to think about, the 32 parts and all of these sorts of practices as unnatural, but actually it's exactly the opposite. It's inclining the mind to see it as it actually is. And in fact, that's the entire Dhamma. That's the entire practice. It's the mind normally is so deluded, it just doesn't see things as they are at all, and things are actually radically different to how they seem through the filter of delusion. And that's really what we're doing through this practice, through all of our practice, is just gradually, filing away at this sort of rock of delusion, and gradually over time, it gets it gets lower and lower and lower. And it's really powerful. So it's very simple, it's very profound, and it just takes a lot of patience. Sorry, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. Yeah, it's inspiring. It's really inspiring to me, and for me, it makes me really excited because it's a realm of practice, or a realm of contemplating the body in that way that I've not done. And it is just contemplating like how the hair really is, what a tooth actually is, what is its nature to decay, and the body as well. And I know for myself, I'm definitely attached to the idea of bodies being very attractive, as my own body and others, and I'm very convinced of this reality. So I think that's part of the trying to keep this sort of practice at arm's length, because I'm like, I don't want to see it that way, but I'm interested, and I think anytime I have this feeling, often engaging with it usually tends to lead to some wonderful results when it's the Dharma. So thank you so much for that. I definitely
Absolutely.
Incorporate it in.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. And so much of the key of this, particularly going to what you were just talking about, is when the minds can see that there's actually a higher happiness than sex, even than sex. Considerably higher happinesses even than that. If you can even connect with that conceptually, that then provides the motivation to do the practice. And then as it starts to do the practice, it starts to feel the fruits of the practice. And then it's like, oh my gosh, it's really true. I really feel happier. I feel better. I feel lighter. Everything feels better. So it becomes this, self-fulfilling, because the mind sees the fruits of the practice.
Yeah. It's one other thing I had down to write about is, for me, going to, and I want to talk about the different variations, but originally I went to 7 precepts, so I was doing brahmacharya. Just the food one was the only one I excluded for a while, and the refraining from sexuality, any sexual contact with myself, with others, it was a very, very liberating experience for me, and in ways that I didn't transcend sexuality by any means, but just the relief of that activity of whatever, dating apps, or you're seeing people in public and, got to talk with them, and just letting go of that has been absolutely, it's been really profound. And the mental pattern of, just this sexual craving, and I think abstaining from the actions around sexual contact um, have been, yeah, I've been very surprised at, like, because I always thought, oh, like only arahants get over lust, so I might as well just like give up and just be lustful. But then realizing like the benefits, the benefits of abstaining, actually there are a lot of benefits, and yeah, experientially, like I was kind of like, wow, this is interesting. I guess the benefits are coming before, arahantship, or whatever. I guess second stage of awakening, people's lust is reduced or something. But anyways, I
It is.
just wanted
That's
to add
right.
that
That's
in,
right.
that feeling of relief. And I think we talked about this at the beginning around all of the precepts having this theme of like renunciation and letting go. And that's what sort of, when we had one of our first calls earlier on, talking about how this, viewing it in this way, because I remember telling you, oh, I don't want to give up dinner, and like, and you were viewing it as like letting go of dinner, not giving up. It's, more like letting go of things, and the whole path being this letting go process. And that really kind of clicked something for me. So, yeah.
That's beautifully said. Yeah, exactly right. And really, when the mind views the precepts in a disempowering way, it views them as a kind of prison. It's like, oh, these things are in the way of me enjoying myself. Is kind of how the mind tends to look at it. But really, when it's really looked at wisely, it is actually the exact opposite of that. Because the defilements, which is really those things that want to enjoy themselves, they are the prison. So let's take craving as an example, right? So one of the things that Buddha talked about so much is that craving it's like being thirsty. It's like if you've drunk seawater. It's just like you can't satiate it. It doesn't matter how much you keep consuming. It just gets worse and worse and worse. So the fire of the craving keeps burning. In fact, it can even get stronger. And that's just the nature of sense pleasures. They're just like that. Like with money, for example, the Buddha said, even if you had a mountain of gold, the height of the Himalayas, and in fact, even if you had two mountains, that would be not enough to satisfy that desire for wealth. So it's completely insatiable. So whether it's sex or whether it's money, whether it's fame, any of these things around which craving tends to contract, there is no amount of it that you can have that's actually going to satisfy it. And so much of the practice is around just inclining the mind to actually see that. It's like, wow, this is insatiable. And, so why is that? Because things are impermanent. Things just come and then they go. So the pleasant feelings that arise when we get stuff, that disappears. And then, either unpleasant feeling comes or neutral feeling comes, but the mind then wants more pleasant feeling. So it's constantly on this kind of hamster wheel of just chasing pleasant feeling through sense pleasures. And it's unsustainable. You can just, it's sustainable in the sense that we've done it since beginning of this time, but it doesn't lead to fulfillment. It doesn't lead to any kind of satiation. It doesn't lead to any kind of peace or ultimate happiness. It's just the mind always thinks that at some point in the future, this is going to work out. I'll have enough. I'll have enough of the stuff that I want, and I'll feel happy. I'll feel peaceful. And it's a lie that the defilements tell us, in a very loud voice as well. So the Buddha's pointing to the truth, which is in fact real happiness, real peace is in exactly the opposite direction. It's in the letting go. It's in the reducing of the craving of the it's just gradually bringing it down, and the ultimate happiness is where that craving is just gone. So even the embers are they've just gone out. And that kind of peace is unimaginable because our minds have just been immersed in desire and the defilements in general since beginning of this time. So to imagine that the happiness, the peace that comes from that fire, from not being on fire, basically, is very, very, very difficult for us to imagine. But the more we practice, the deeper we practice, the more we renounce, the more the heart starts to taste it, starts to see it, taste it, feel it, and it's like, whoa, oh yeah, I can see this does actually go in the direction of peace, and the other does not.
Yeah, it's really, really beautifully said, Paul. Makes me definitely feel inspired to keep practicing, and almost miraculous that it's even possible in some ways that this path, like you said, with all this momentum and our history of engaging with it, the fact that it's possible to make any progress in the other direction is really definitely inspiring to say the least.
100%, 100%. Yeah, exactly. And it's, so you probably know the famous story of when, when the Buddha awakened, and he looked, using the eye of the Buddha, of the Sama Sambuddha, seeing all of these beings, all of us, you know, burning with suffering, just and not understanding how to actually attain happiness, how to actually attain peace, and in fact doing all the things which actually lead to more suffering. So seeing that, and then reflecting, how is this? Is the Dhamma, that the Dhamma of what actually does lead to happiness? How is anybody even going to listen to this? And for a while, even disinclining to teach at all, just thinking there's no point in me teaching. And then Brahma Sahampati coming to him and saying, Venerable Sir, there are those with little dust in their eyes who can hear this, who do have the listening, who do have the parami for this, who, when you speak the Dhamma, their hearts will understand what you're saying, and they will practice, and they will attain. So it's rare wisdom, in the sense that wisdom which is very rarely heard and rarely listened to as well. When a Buddha arises, they teach many beings, and a relatively small number actually really pay attention. So but it's wonderful, your own heart has just such phenomenal parami, and for me, our friendship has been it's been a great blessing for me, because to be able to, for us to be able to speak Dhamma and share the Dhamma together, and for me to be able to see your own Dhamma heart and how through your own practice, how much the Dhamma has impacted your life, and the aspiration that you have towards freedom that's rare. It's really rare in the world. So for me, our friendship is very special.
Thank you, Paul. You're gonna make me cry. Yeah, I love you, man. I really appreciate you giving your time today.
Thank you.
All those words, it means a lot.
Thank you. No, it's been great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor, really.
For sure. Yeah, I think I definitely learned a tremendous amount, and I'm also very appreciative for meeting you and having you as a mentor, and I can't thank you enough. And I got a lot of love for you, man. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much.
For sure. So we're coming up on the end of our time here, in terms of.
Sure.
Basically, we haven't. Yeah, we have the call will end soon, and I wanted to thank you again, Paul, for your time. It's I really appreciate it, and I'm sure whoever listens to this will hopefully get something out of it. And once again, this is from Dharma Gates, which is a nonprofit based in the U.S., though neither of us are in the U.S. right now, but and our goal is to bring meditation and Buddhist practice to young people in a deep way, is the idea. And we have retreats coming up this year and next. We have one coming up next week in New York, so if you listen to this, there's still some spots left. And then we have one in Colorado, and you can look at both of those at dharma-gates.org. And once again, my name is Nikki, and I was one of the founders and board members still of Dharma Gates. And Paul, is there any way people wanted to hear more from you or about you, or do you have any sort of online presence, or I don't know, social media, something like that?
Well, what I would say, I mean, I've until relatively recently, at least, led a pretty intentionally pretty secluded life out of out of the teaching limelight. I'm teaching more and more and coaching more and more, and for sure, I would love to support anybody who's listening to this who who would like to talk through their own practice, and who's got any questions. I would love to be able to help you. So we'll figure out through Dharma Gates a way of you reaching me, and yeah, I'm here for you. We could do one-on-one coaching anytime. I coach a lot of people one-to-one, so totally we can do that.
Awesome. Sounds great. Yeah, well, I'll link to that. I guess show notes is something podcasts do. I don't know how that works yet, but hopefully we can sort that out to have Dharma Gates linked, and then also, yeah, the opportunity
awesome.
to get in touch with Paul if you feel inspired to that end. And yeah, cool. Well, yeah, thanks again, Paul.
Brilliant.
Lots of love to you.
Thanks, Nikki.
Yeah.
Yeah, likewise. Great. All right.
All right.
Sadhu. Thank you.
Thank you.